The checkout receipt printed at exactly 9:03 every Memorial Day. Same borrower, same worn history book, same return date. For 19 straight years, nobody questioned it. Then a pressed wildflower slipped quietly from between the pages and landed on the circulation desk. If you have ever wondered how a simple promise can outlive the people who made it, I hope you'll stay with me. I had been working at the Ashford Public Library for only 3 weeks when I noticed the pattern. The library was the kind of place where routines rarely changed. Mr. Jenkins claimed the same reading chair every Tuesday. Mrs. Alvarez borrowed 3 mysteries every Friday afternoon. Children filled the story corner every Saturday morning. But no routine was as precise as Thomas Hale's. At exactly 9:03 every Memorial Day, he entered through the front doors, carrying a neatly folded navy jacket over one arm. He greeted everyone with the same warm smile, signed the checkout card for the same weathered military history book, thanked whoever happened to be working the desk, and quietly walked away. The following morning, almost to the minute, he returned it. No late fees, no conversation about the book, no exceptions. Does he actually read it? I asked my supervisor after watching him leave. She smiled without looking up from her paperwork. Every year. For only one night? So it seems. Why that particular book? She shrugged. I stopped wondering years ago. That answer somehow made me even more curious. Thomas didn't seem like a man driven by habit alone. He handled the book with remarkable care, almost as though he were borrowing something that belonged to a close friend rather than a public library. Later that afternoon, I found the circulation records. 19 Memorial Days. 19 identical checkouts. No other borrower had taken the book during that time. As I carefully returned it to the processing table, something fragile drifted onto the polished wood. A tiny pressed blue wildflower. Perfectly preserved. I gently lifted it between 2 fingers, afraid it might crumble. Inside the front cover, written in faded blue ink, were 4 simple words. For Daniel, keep remembering. There was no last name, no date, no dedication from the publisher. Just those 4 words in unmistakably personal handwriting. I quickly checked the catalog record. Nothing mentioned an inscription. Nothing mentioned a flower. When Thomas returned the next morning, I placed the book on the counter exactly where he would find it. His smile remained calm until he opened the cover. Then his eyes searched the pages with quiet urgency. He looked up at me. Did anything fall out? I hesitated for only a second before placing the pressed flower beside the book. Relief softened his face. He picked it up with extraordinary care. "Thank you," he whispered. I was afraid I'd lost it. I wanted to ask a dozen questions. Instead, I simply said, "It seems very important." He looked at the flower for a long moment before closing the book. "It is." He signed the return slip, nodded politely, and walked toward the exit. Just before reaching the front doors, he stopped. Without turning around, he quietly said, "Some promises aren't written on paper." Then he stepped into the bright Memorial Day morning, leaving me alone with one unanswered question. Who was Daniel? And why had one little wildflower been worth protecting for nearly 20 years? I couldn't stop thinking about the inscription after Thomas left. For Daniel, keep remembering. 4 simple words, yet they carried the weight of something far larger than a personal note scribbled inside an old library book. The following morning, before the library opened, I quietly searched the circulation archive. Our records stretched back decades, first on handwritten cards and later in digital files. Most books had been borrowed by hundreds of readers over the years. Not this one. Every Memorial Day for 19 consecutive years, Thomas Hale had checked it out. No birthdays, no Veterans Day, no random weekends, only Memorial Day. When I finished comparing the dates, another detail caught my attention. The very first checkout had occurred almost 6 months before Thomas officially joined the library staff. That didn't make sense. If he wasn't working here yet, how had the tradition already begun? When Thomas arrived that afternoon to help shelve returned books, he greeted me with the same calm smile. "Good morning, Emily." "Morning." He immediately noticed the circulation ledger still lying open on my desk. "You've been studying old records." "I've been trying to understand." He didn't appear upset, only thoughtful. Understanding usually takes longer than searching. I believe that. He carefully stacked several returned novels onto a cart before speaking again. The library teaches patience better than almost anywhere. I watched him move through the shelves. His pace was slow but remarkably deliberate. Every book found its place without hesitation. Every damaged spine received a gentle touch. It reminded me of the way he had handled the pressed flower, almost reverently. Near closing time, an elderly woman entered carrying a bouquet of fresh blue wildflowers wrapped in brown paper. Thomas immediately stopped shelving books. "Margaret?" She smiled warmly. "I almost missed you. You never have." Without another word, she handed him the flowers. He accepted them carefully, but removed only one small blossom. The rest he returned to her. "I only need one." "I know." Neither of them explained. Margaret noticed me watching. "You must be Emily." I nodded. "It's nice to meet you. You've been asking questions." Before I could apologize, she smiled kindly. "Curiosity isn't disrespect." She glanced toward Thomas. "Sometimes it's how promises survive." Those words settled quietly between us. After Margaret left, I finally asked the question that had been growing in my mind all day. Did she know Daniel? Thomas remained silent for several moments. She knew someone who did. "Is Daniel your friend?" "He was." The answer came softly. No hesitation, no attempt to change the subject. Just enough truth to keep the conversation honest. "I'm sorry. So am I." He picked up the history book from the returns cart. For a moment, his fingers rested on the worn cover. "I met Daniel when we were both young soldiers." His eyes drifted toward the library window overlooking the town square. "We made each other a promise before either of us understood how expensive promises can become." Before I could ask what promise he meant, the library clock chimed 6. Thomas closed the book. "We're finished for today." As he walked toward the staff room, something slipped from the inside pocket of his jacket. Not the pressed flower. A faded library checkout card. I picked it up after he disappeared around the corner. The handwriting was older than the computer records. At the top of the card, the very first borrower of the book was listed. Daniel Mercer. Thomas wasn't the one who had started the Memorial Day tradition. He had only been faithfully continuing it. I slipped the old checkout card back into its paper sleeve before Thomas returned. For several seconds, I simply stared at the name. Daniel Mercer. The ink had faded to a soft gray, but the signature beneath the checkout date remained surprisingly clear. Memorial Day. 19 years earlier. The card raised more questions than it answered. If Daniel had been the first to borrow the book, why had Thomas continued the tradition after him? And why had no one else in the library ever mentioned Daniel Mercer? I carefully returned the card to Thomas's jacket pocket, exactly where I had found it. Not because I wanted to hide what I had seen, because for the first time, I felt that whatever this was belonged to someone else's trust before it belonged to my curiosity. The next morning, Thomas arrived carrying a small cardboard box filled with donated books. He smiled as though nothing unusual had happened. "Would you help me with local history?" "Of course." We spent the next hour shelving old county records, family biographies, and faded yearbooks. Thomas worked methodically despite the obvious strain in his eyes. Several times he held a book farther away before reading its spine. "You should probably get stronger glasses," I said. He laughed quietly. "My optometrist keeps telling me the same thing, but you still volunteer 3 days a week." I made a commitment. Even when it's difficult? He slid another book into place. Especially then. That answer stayed with me. Around lunchtime, an elderly gentleman entered the library carrying a folded American flag inside a protective case. Thomas immediately walked around the circulation desk. "Harold, it's good to see you." The two men shook hands without saying another word for several seconds. Old friends rarely seemed to need many words. Harold noticed me organizing returned books. "You must be Emily." "I am." He smiled warmly. "Thomas finally has someone keeping him organized." Thomas chuckled. "She's trying." Harold rested the flag case gently on a nearby table. "I came to donate Robert's letters." Thomas's expression softened. "I wasn't expecting that. I wasn't ready before." Neither man explained who Robert was. Instead, Thomas carefully carried the small box of letters toward the archive room. "Would you come with me, Emily?" Inside the archive, rows of acid-free storage boxes lined the shelves. Thomas handled the letters with extraordinary care, wearing white cotton gloves before touching a single envelope. "You preserve everything." "I try." "Because of your army work?" He nodded. "I spent most of my service protecting records." He smiled faintly. "People think paperwork isn't important until memory depends on it." As he cataloged the donation, I noticed one envelope already resting inside the archive drawer. Its return address matched Daniel Mercer's name. The postmark was dated more than 20 years earlier. I looked toward Thomas. "You've kept his letters." "I've kept everyone's." "Not everyone's." He paused. "No." His voice grew softer. "Not everyone's." Before I could ask another question, Margaret Lawson quietly appeared in the doorway. She had returned carrying another bouquet of fresh blue wildflowers. Only this time she wasn't smiling. "I visited the hillside this morning," she said. Thomas slowly removed his glasses. "Were there many left?" "Fewer than last year." Silence filled the room. Finally, Margaret looked at me. "You've been wondering why Thomas borrows that book." I nodded. She gently placed one blue wildflower beside Daniel's old envelope. "The answer isn't inside the book." She looked directly at Thomas. "It began long before either of us ever walked into this library." Thomas lowered his eyes. For the first time since I had met him, he didn't try to protect the mystery. He only whispered, "I think she's ready to know where the promise was made." The following Saturday, Thomas asked if I would meet him before the library opened. "We're taking a short drive," he said. He didn't tell me where we were going. He didn't have to. Somehow I already knew the answer waited beyond the library walls. We left town just after sunrise. The roads gradually narrowed until the pavement gave way to an old gravel lane winding through rolling hills covered with spring grass. Thomas finally stopped beside a weathered wooden fence. No sign marked the place. No monument stood nearby. Only a quiet hillside where clusters of small blue wildflowers swayed gently beneath the morning breeze. "They bloom for only a few weeks each year," Thomas said. "They always have." Neither of us spoke for a while. He walked slowly into the field, carefully avoiding the blossoms until he reached a smooth limestone boulder overlooking the valley. He rested one hand against the stone. "This is where Daniel and I came home." I looked at him, confused. "Home?" We had both finished our military service. We drove here before either of us returned to our families. His eyes remained fixed on the hillside. We were trying to figure out how to become ordinary men again. A quiet smile crossed his face. It turned out neither of us knew how. Thomas knelt carefully despite the stiffness in his knees and picked a single blue wildflower. Only one. He never reached for another. "Daniel noticed these flowers first," he continued. "He said they survived because nobody paid much attention to them." He gently turned the blossom between his fingers. He admired that. I remembered the pressed flower hidden inside the book. "So every Memorial Day, I return here." He nodded. "I gather one flower." His voice softened. "Then I borrow the book." I waited. Thomas looked toward the horizon before continuing. Daniel believed remembrance should never become performance. He worried that people sometimes remembered names without remembering lives. "So you created the ritual together?" "We did." He smiled sadly. "We promised that every Memorial Day we would meet through one chapter of that history book." "Why that book?" "Because it wasn't about famous battles." He looked at me. "It was about ordinary people who quietly kept serving after they came home." The answer settled deeply inside me. Suddenly, the history book no longer seemed like an object. It felt like a meeting place. Thomas carefully placed the fresh wildflower inside a small envelope. "I always replaced the previous year's flower, so every blossom inside the book stayed there for only 1 year." I stared at him. "I thought it was the same flower." He shook his head gently. "No. The promise stayed. The flower kept changing." For the first time, I understood why the ritual mattered. It wasn't preserving the past unchanged. It was proving that remembrance had remained alive for another year. As we walked back toward the truck, Thomas stopped beside the old fence. There was one part of the promise we never expected. "What was that?" He looked down at the envelope holding the fresh blossom. Daniel died unexpectedly less than a year after we made it. Silence filled the hillside. I almost stopped coming. His voice trembled for the first time. It felt foolish to keep meeting someone who could never arrive. So why didn't you? Thomas reached into his jacket and removed the worn history book. I visited Margaret. He carefully opened the inside cover. For Daniel, keep remembering. He smiled through quiet sadness. She told me the promise no longer belonged only to the two of us. I looked at the inscription again. It belonged to everyone whose life had been changed by his kindness. Just then, a brittle crack echoed through the quiet morning. One corner of the aging book's spine separated as Thomas gently closed it. Neither of us moved. He slowly ran his fingers across the damaged binding. I was afraid this day would come. I looked at the loose pages beginning to separate. The book can't survive many more checkouts. Thomas nodded. No. He carefully held it against his chest. And if the book can't make another Memorial Day, his words faded into the wind, then neither can the promise, unless someone else is willing to carry it. The drive back from the hillside felt much longer than the drive there. Neither of us spoke very much. Thomas kept the history book resting carefully across his lap, one hand gently supporting the weakened spine every time the truck rolled over a bump. For the first time since I had met him, he looked less like the guardian of a tradition and more like a man preparing to say goodbye to an old friend. When we returned to the library, he unlocked the archive room without a word. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, illuminating shelves filled with carefully labeled boxes, local newspapers, donated letters, and photographs from generations of town history. Until that moment, I had believed Thomas preserved books. Now I understood that he preserved people. He placed the damaged volume on a padded conservation table. I've repaired this binding 3 times. He smiled faintly. Every repair lasted 1 more year. I examined the loose pages. The paper is becoming brittle. It was already old when Daniel first borrowed it. He removed a pair of white cotton gloves from a drawer and carefully opened the cover. The pressed wildflower rested exactly where I expected. Beside it lay a folded sheet of cream-colored paper I had never noticed before. You've kept a letter inside? I never kept it hidden. He looked at me kindly. No one ever thought to ask. He unfolded the paper with extraordinary care. The handwriting belonged to Daniel. If either of us is left to make this journey alone, don't let Memorial Day become only about loss. Read 1 chapter, leave 1 flower, then go back to serving the living. I read the words twice before looking up. He wrote this before he died? Thomas nodded. 3 months before. He knew? He had been diagnosed with an aggressive illness. Silence settled between us. I wanted to believe the doctors were wrong. Thomas's voice remained steady, but his eyes carried decades of quiet grief. Daniel spent his last months making sure everyone else was ready. He smiled gently. I never was. Just then Margaret entered the archive carrying a small storage case. I thought you might need these. Inside were dozens of pressed blue wildflowers, each protected between sheets of archival paper. I stared at them. You kept everyone? Margaret nodded. Thomas replaced the flower in the book every year. She lifted one of the preserved blossoms. I couldn't bear to throw the others away. There were 19 of them. 19 Memorial Days. 19 promises faithfully kept. Thomas looked almost embarrassed. I never intended for anyone to save them. Margaret smiled. You weren't the only one keeping a promise. Those words changed everything. For years, I had believed Thomas carried this responsibility alone. He never had. Others had quietly protected the tradition beside him without asking for recognition. That afternoon, I contacted the Regional Library Preservation Center. The conservator listened patiently as I described the book's condition. When I finished, she sighed. It can be stabilized. Hope flickered inside me. But it shouldn't continue circulating. Not even once a year? I'm afraid not. I slowly lowered the phone. The answer felt unavoidable. The book could survive. The ritual could not. When I shared the news, Thomas simply nodded. I expected that. You already knew? I've known for a while. He looked toward the worn cover. I just wasn't ready to admit it. I thought about Daniel's letter. Go back to serving the living. Maybe the promise had never depended on a single book. Maybe it depended on someone willing to understand why the book mattered. As evening settled over the quiet library, Thomas placed the history book back inside its protective box. Tomorrow is Memorial Day, he said. I think this will be my last checkout. I wanted to argue. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. What if it doesn't have to be the last promise? Thomas looked at me for a long moment. Hope and sorrow met quietly in his tired smile. We'll find out tomorrow. Memorial Day arrived beneath a clear spring sky. The town awakened earlier than usual. American flags lined the sidewalks leading toward the courthouse square. Children carried handmade wreaths, and veterans wearing neatly pressed jackets quietly greeted one another before the annual ceremony. Inside Ashford Public Library, however, everything remained almost exactly as it always had. The silence felt familiar. Comforting. Thomas unlocked the front doors at precisely 9 o'clock. He paused only once before stepping inside. His hand rested gently against the worn leather satchel carrying the history book. I've never been nervous before, he admitted. I smiled softly. You've done this 19 times. I know. He looked toward the reading room. This feels different. Because it was. For the first time, he wasn't carrying the promise alone. Margaret arrived a few minutes later with another bouquet of fresh blue wildflowers. Instead of handing one directly to Thomas, she placed the flowers on the circulation desk between us. I thought today should belong to both of you. Thomas looked at the blossoms but didn't immediately reach for them. Instead, he opened the protective case holding the old history book. The weakened spine had been wrapped in a temporary conservation sleeve, allowing one final careful handling before permanent preservation. I suppose this is our last checkout, he whispered. I gently shook my head. I don't think so. He looked at me with quiet curiosity. Before he could respond, Mayor Daniel Reeves entered the library carrying a folder beneath one arm. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Thomas answered. The mayor removed several papers from the folder. I've spent the last 2 days reading the journals, Daniel's letter, and the archive notes. He smiled warmly. I had no idea our town had been preserving a Memorial Day tradition inside this library. Thomas looked slightly uncomfortable. It wasn't meant to become public. I understand. The mayor nodded. And it won't become a spectacle. He unfolded a single typed page. I'd like to propose something. Margaret folded her hands quietly. The mayor continued. Rather than ending the tradition because the book can no longer circulate, let's preserve the book permanently. Thomas lowered his eyes. Then the promise ends. Only if the promise depends on paper. The words settled over the room. I reached into my desk drawer and removed a newly bound archival journal. The cover was simple, dark blue cloth. No decoration except one line embossed in silver. The memorial book tradition. Thomas stared at it without speaking. I opened the first page. The original book taught us why remembrance matters. I smiled. This journal can record how each generation chooses to continue remembering. Margaret placed one fresh blue wildflower beside the open page. The mayor quietly added his signature beneath a short statement describing the town's commitment to preserving both the original history book and Daniel's promise. No speeches. No formal proclamation. Just 4 signatures. Thomas, Margaret, the mayor, and finally, mine. Thomas remained silent for several moments. Then he carefully removed the fresh blue wildflower from the bouquet. Instead of placing it inside the fragile history book, he laid it gently between the opening pages of the new journal. I never promised Daniel I would protect one book. His voice grew stronger. I promised I would protect the reason we opened it. Tears gathered quietly in Margaret's eyes. He would have liked that. Just before noon, the annual Memorial Day ceremony began outside. Families gathered beneath rows of waving flags. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder. Children carried photographs of loved ones they had never met. When the ceremony ended, many visitors wandered into the library to view the newly preserved history book displayed inside a climate-controlled case. Beside it rested the new journal. No dramatic signs, only one small plaque. Read, remember, serve the living. People lingered much longer than anyone expected. Some wrote memories of relatives who had served. Others simply placed a single flower beside the journal before quietly leaving. Watching them, I realized something extraordinary. The promise had not become smaller because it was shared. It had become stronger. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the library windows, Thomas stood beside the display case without saying a word. Finally, he turned toward me. I thought today would be an ending. I smiled. I think today was the first chapter. He looked at the journal already holding its first handful of handwritten memories. For the first time since Daniel's passing, Thomas believed that might actually be true. 1 year passed more quickly than any of us expected. The library looked almost exactly the same. The polished oak circulation desk still welcomed visitors each morning. Children still hurried toward the reading corner after school. Retirees still gathered near the large front windows to exchange quiet conversations over newspapers and coffee. Only one thing had changed. Near the local history shelves, a climate-controlled display now held the worn military history book that had carried Daniel's promise for nearly 2 decades. Visitors paused before it almost every day. Not because it was rare, because they finally understood why it mattered. The blue journal beside the display had slowly begun to fill. Families wrote memories of fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, neighbors, teachers, and friends whose lives had quietly shaped the community. No story was measured by medals, only by kindness, only by service, only by the lives left better behind. Thomas continued volunteering every Tuesday and Thursday morning. His eyesight had weakened further, making it difficult to read the smallest print, but he still greeted every visitor by name whenever he could. Sometimes he simply stood beside the memorial book display, watching people read Daniel's letter. He never interrupted. He never explained. The story had finally learned to speak for itself. One rainy afternoon, I found him carefully turning the pages of the new journal. "There are more than 300 entries now," I said. He smiled. I stopped counting. "You started something extraordinary." He gently shook his head. "No." He tapped Daniel's letter through the protective glass. He did. Just then, Mayor Reeves entered carrying a sealed envelope. "I've been looking for both of you." He placed the envelope on the desk. "It arrived from the State Historical Commission." Thomas looked puzzled. "I didn't submit anything." "I know." The mayor smiled. "The visitors did." Inside the envelope was a formal certificate recognizing Ashford Public Library as a community site of living remembrance. The commission praised the town for preserving military memory through education, service, and intergenerational storytelling, rather than permanent exhibits alone. Thomas quietly read the final paragraph. Then he folded the letter. "I appreciate this." He paused. "But I hope people remember why we began." "They will," I said. "How can you be sure?" Instead of answering, I walked to the display. A young boy stood reading Daniel's letter while his grandfather waited patiently nearby. After several moments, the boy looked up. "Grandpa?" "Yes?" "Can we bring flowers next Memorial Day?" The older man smiled. "I think he'd like that." The child nodded seriously. "Not because we knew him." He looked again at the display. "Because someone remembered him until we could." Thomas quietly wiped a tear from the corner of his eye. "That's how." A week later, the library board held its annual meeting. One final item appeared on the agenda. Emily Carter, Director of Community History Programs. I stared at the printed title. "I didn't apply." The board president laughed gently. "No. You've already been doing the work." Thomas remained unusually quiet throughout the meeting. Only after everyone else had left did he walk beside me toward the display. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed the old paper checkout card, the one bearing Daniel Mercer's name. "I've carried this every day for 20 years. He placed it into my hand. "It belongs with the journal now." I looked at him in surprise. "Are you certain?" "I've never been more certain." Together we placed the faded checkout card inside the journal's opening page beside Daniel's letter. The first borrower, the first promise, the beginning of everything. Thomas rested his hand lightly on the cover. "I spent years believing I was preserving Daniel's memory." He smiled with quiet peace. "What I was really preserving was the chance for someone else to remember him." As we turned off the library lights that evening, the display case remained softly illuminated. Inside rested one old history book, one handwritten letter, one faded checkout card, and hundreds of new stories waiting to greet the next visitor. For the first time since Daniel's passing, Thomas walked toward the door without looking back. He no longer needed to make sure the promise would survive. He had already seen it living in other hands. 1 year later, Memorial Day returned with the quiet certainty of sunrise. Ashford awakened beneath clear blue skies. Flags lined the streets once again. Children carried bouquets almost as large as themselves. Veterans exchanged warm handshakes before gathering at the courthouse square. Inside the library, the first visitors arrived even before the doors officially opened. Some came to borrow books. Others came for something they had never expected to find inside a public library. Hope. The climate-controlled display remained exactly where Thomas had helped place it. The weathered history book rested beside Daniel's handwritten letter. The faded checkout card remained tucked safely inside the opening page of the Memorial Book Tradition Journal. Only one detail had changed. Between the journal's newest pages rested a freshly pressed blue wildflower. I had gathered it at sunrise from the hillside Thomas first showed me 1 year earlier, just as he once had. Thomas entered a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He moved more slowly now. Age had continued its quiet work, yet his smile seemed lighter than I had ever seen. "You remembered," he said. "I promised." He looked toward the blue flower resting inside the journal. "No." He gently shook his head. "You understood." Those words meant more than any award, title, or recognition ever could. Families gradually filled the reading room. Many paused before the display. Several quietly added handwritten memories to the growing journal. One elderly widow described how her husband had taught neighborhood children to raise the flag every morning. A former Army medic wrote about a fellow soldier who never considered himself a hero despite saving countless lives. A teenage girl thanked her grandfather for showing her that courage often sounded like kindness instead of loud speeches. Every story felt different. Every story belonged. Near noon, a young boy approached the circulation desk carrying a small notebook. He couldn't have been older than 9. "Excuse me." "Yes?" "My teacher told us about Mr. Daniel." I smiled. "What would you like to know?" He pointed toward the display. "Was he famous?" I looked at Thomas. He quietly smiled and shook his head. I turned back to the boy. "No." "Then why do people still remember him?" The answer came more easily than I expected. "Because he helped one person remember." The boy thought about that for several seconds. Then he carefully opened his notebook and wrote one sentence. "Maybe that's how ordinary people become unforgettable." Thomas quietly wiped another tear from his eye. As the afternoon ceremony concluded outside, visitors returned to the library one final time before heading home. The reading room gradually grew quiet again. Only Thomas and I remained beside the display. He looked toward Daniel's letter one last time. "You know," he said softly, "I spent 20 years believing I was fulfilling Daniel's promise." "You were," he smiled. "Only part of it." He rested one hand on the journal. The other part was making sure someone else would someday continue without me. I reached into the journal and gently placed this year's blue wildflower between the newest pages. The tradition no longer belonged to one book, or one librarian, or one family. It belonged to every person willing to remember with humility, gratitude, and quiet service. If this story reminded you that the smallest acts of faithfulness often become the greatest legacies, I hope you'll carry that thought into your own life. Sometimes we imagine history is preserved by monuments. Sometimes we believe it survives through speeches. But more often, history endures because one ordinary person quietly keeps a promise until another ordinary person is ready to receive it. Thank you for spending this time with us. May God bless you. May those who served never be forgotten, and may every promise rooted in honor, kindness, and remembrance continue to live, one generation after another.